Welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab and continuing with our series on answer writing for general studies papers of civil service main examination. We take up a question that you might come across in GS paper 2. Here goes the question. The significance of R Bommai versus Union of India 1994 lies in upholding principles that define the spirit of a democratic federal polity. We are assuming that most of you are aware of the fact of the R Bommai judgment. That is, in this case, the executive's prerogatives, the executive's privilege to apply precedence rule in the case of a state was challenged. That is, whether the union executive is absolutely free to impose precedence rule in a particular state on the pretext of, for example, breakdown of constitutional machinery, or for that matter, the state government losing majority. In this particular case, it was argued that the state government had lost majority. That is, Mr. Bommai had lost majority. However, coming back to this question, what is to be careful about this question, that this question does not require you to talk about the fact of the matter, the fact of the case. Rather, it requires you to talk about the principles that are the defining features of the democratic or federal polity that is practiced in India. You have to talk how the R Bommai versus Union of India 1994, it essentially upholds the principles which can be said to be like the basic principles, the fundamental principles of the spirit, the very spirit of a democratic and federal polity. You have to elaborate on it. How we are introducing our answer? We are going into the very background of inclusion of this provision, that is the provision of precedence rule in the constitution. Finding it necessary to include emergency provisions in constitution, part 8, the founding fathers had expressed this fervent hope that these provisions which led to curtailment of democracy would be used sparingly. Please recall Dr. Ambedkar, when he said that he hoped that the provision under Article 352, that is national emergency, would remain a dead letter. That is, it would remain on the book. That is, while it would be in the constitution, it would be rarely actually applied. This was the hope that Dr. Ambedkar had, you could say, had. But the point is, this hope was often betrayed. Alas, the hope was betrayed when later governments started using the provisions, essentially Article 356, to advance their political goals. The provision of precedence rule under Article 356 was employed to take over states which were administered by opposition. So again, the point is, something that had to be used sparingly was used to further one's political goal. That basically the political goal of the union. In the year 1989, as we have already talked about, Karnataka's government headed by Sri R Bommai was dissolved on the pretext that it had lost majority in the assembly. Later, the assembly too was dissolved. The state was put under precedence rule. This is fact of the case actually. Upon being challenged, the Honorable Supreme Court made pronouncements favoring Sri Bommai. Moreover, the Honorable Supreme Court elucidated core principles of a democratic federal polity, which we would define later in the lecture actually. These principles appeal to the federal and democratic spirit permeating India's polity. You can argue that the very soul of India's political system, the very soul of India's constitutional system, is democratic and federal. This perhaps is the true significance of R Bommai. Its true significance lying in expounding the principles that can be said to be the very part of the soul of the federal and democratic system that we practice. So, what are the principles that were elaborated, that were explicated by R Bommai case 1994? First is the principle of democratic accountability and non-arbitrariness. That is, president's proclamation is subject to judicial review. The point is, it's not as if the president has unrestricted or unchecked power. Essentially, the executive does not have unrestricted or unchecked power to, you could say, impose president's rule in a particular state. The executive has to be answerable. It has to answer to the system through judicial review. That is, judicial review can be applied in this case. Then it is the rule of law that prevails over executive action, which can be overturned. If the executive action for some reason is found not to be in the true scheme of the thing, rather it is against the very, you could say, idea of the, you could say, rule of law. For an example, it is based on something that is colored by political motives, etc., the executive action can be overturned, as we would see through a real example. Then comes the principle of democratic supremacy. What it essentially means, that it is the democratic system, that is the will of the people, which is expressed either through the, you could say, opinion of the assembly or the parliament, that prevails over the executives, you could say, prerogative, privileges, etc. That is, Article 356, coming back to Article 356 requires parliamentary approval, and you can understand this very, very well. If it requires parliamentary approval, it is essentially in the scheme of democratic supremacy. That is, it is essentially the will of the people expressed through parliament that would apply in the case of Article 356 as well, President's rule as well. Moreover, the case had it that the majority of a government can be tested only on the floor of a house, either parliament or assembly. We would repeat it. The R Bommai said that majority of a government, whether a government enjoys majority or it has already lost majority, can be decided only on the floor of the assembly or parliament, for that matter. It also talks about the federal spirit, and it goes on to say that federalism is part of the very basic structure, and that way it is inalienable. That is, it cannot be taken away. Moreover, even if it's curtailed, whatever the restrictions that are to be placed on it have to be according to the constitutional norms. It places checks on executive power. That is, it should not be excessive. Please try to connect it through the actual Constituent Assembly Constituent Assembly debates, that the constitution makers had said that the provisions under Part 8 are meant to cater to exigency. They are meant to cater to emergency. So they cannot be applied arbitrarily, and they cannot be excessive. If at all these provisions have to be applied, for an example, Article 356 is to be applied, it should not be excessive. It should be actually quite restrained. Elaborating on these points, by holding President's proclamation under Article 356 subject to judicial review, the Honorable Supreme Court iterates accountability and non-arbitrariness. This does not need further explanation. The Bommai 1994 case held that President rule can be overturned. Please, again, we would repeat it. Bommai 1994 held that President's rule can be overturned, assembly revived, and the state government restored if grounds of imposing President's rule were found irrelevant or malified. If the grounds of imposing President's rule were found irrelevant or malified, the entire President's rule would be rescinded, and there is possibility that the government too would be restored. Irrelevant, something that is again beyond the, you could say, the rational criteria, and Malafide would essentially point to political motive rather than real constitutional breakdown. It would mean that there was some political motive of the union government due to which it imposed precedence rule in a particular state. Moreover, requiring that proclamations under Article 356 require parliamentary approval within 2 months, it also holds that majority of a state government cannot be decided. Moreover, it also holds that majority of a state government cannot be decided by governor but disproved or proved in the assembly. Essentially, the point is not only the provision requires the approval of the parliament, moreover, it also has it that if at all the majority of a state government is to be decided, it will be decided not by the governor, that the governor cannot say whether the state government has lost or continues to enjoy majority. That can be done only on the floor of the assembly. This way, these two provisions, that is parliamentary approval and the provision of majority proved only on the floor of the house, this upholds the democratic spirit. These requirements reaffirm democratic supremacy over the executive. That is, the executive has to be answerable to the democratic system. The will of the people expressed through the, you could say, the will of the parliament or assembly. The judgment explicitly says that the states are constituent units of the Indian Federation rather than mere appendages. That is, it's not as if the states are of only ornamental purpose. Rather, they are fundamental. They are, you could say, basic constituent units, the basic units through which the Indian Union has been constituted. By articulating federalism as part of basic structure, the Honorable Court nods to the federal spirit of our constitution. Again, while we are here, what do you understand by federal spirit? Actually, this question can be, you could say, explained in different manner. But in my understanding, what federalism means, the federal spirit means that the constituent units have their constitution guaranteed existence. That is, they are not on the mercy of the union. We would repeat it. The states are not at the mercy of the union for their existence. Moreover, going beyond, we can also understand that they have their separate jurisdictions. They have their separate powers in which the union is barred from encroaching. We would repeat it. Federal spirit means that the states have their separate power, separate jurisdiction in which the union is barred from interfering or even encroaching. Then the judgment talks of checks on power of the executive. It has to be accountable and convincing to exercise the extraordinary powers conferred under Article 356, which are meant to cater to an exigency. Actually, the power that are granted under Article 352, 356 or even 360, that is financial emergency, are of, you could say, extraordinary nature. They are meant to cater to an emergency, exigency, etc. So they have to be always restrained. Otherwise, what would happen if they were to be exercised without restraint, unrestrained? It would mean that the democratic or the federal, you could say, rights of the people would be actually violated. They would be actually, someone would actually ride roughshod over your rights. So that is why the court provided in Bommai that the power exercised under Article 356 would have to be restrained. Now, the conclusion we are making here, that elegantly articulating the defining principles of a federal polity in a democratic setup, Bommai 1994 goes a long way in checking misuses and abuses of the provisions, and in fact it also puts restraint on executive action. It has been often evoked in many cases, including the more recent Nabam Rebia, that is Arunachal Pradesh Assembly case, and Shivraj Singh Chauhan, that is Madhya Pradesh Assembly cases. In the actually the Bommai case, the pronouncement made under Bommai 1994 have been cited in many cases since then, two of which are Nabam Rebia in Arunachal Pradesh and Sivraj Singh Chauhan in the case of Madhya Pradesh. This was all on SR Bommai versus Union of India 1994, how it upholds the spirit of, you could say, federal and democratic polity in India. This is all for today. We would reassemble for the next lecture in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.